Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cabinet Mission Guy. In this episode we're going to continue our series on JavaScript and we're going to start to bring to an end our mini-series on creating our first JavaScript UCS. I'm really happy with the functionality that we've included so far with our UCS, but I've got a few jobs left to do before I'd call it finished. As I'm sure you can tell by now, the way that I like to go about writing a UCS is probably subconsciously I would go about machining something, so we tend to take roughing passes and then come along at the end and do a finishing pass. And what I mean by that is, if I just head up to my code in my UCS, while we're playing with different functionality and we're not quite sure what the UCS is going to do, we tend to do things like create variables up at the top, and especially ones that have CV attributes associated with them. And as you can see, I've just set these to have a name of my L filler overlap. And we've even got some uppercase and lowercase issues in here as well. So I'd like to come through and rename my variables, and also with my CV attribute names, I like to make sure that I include something like the UCS name in these to make them individual. I have to make this work, obviously with maybe several different UCSs that are in my system that all have attributes in them. So it's just nice to go through, rename these and make sure that this UCS plays nicely with your other UCSs in your system. So I'm going to go ahead and just run through and rename these. I'm just going to do a normal rename for the CV attributes up at the top. And the naming system that I'm going to use is just to take an abbreviated version of the UCS name, add side fillers, and instead of my, I'm going to replace it with ASF. Now for the variable names, what we're going to do is we're going to replace these because these are obviously used throughout our code and the rest of our UCS. So it's also good if you're doing this to make a backup of the UCS. You will, when going through this process, make a mistake at some point. As you've seen in the rest of the videos, it's quite easy to do. So it's always good to just to have a backup there just in case. So to replace these, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a copy of the variable name that I want to replace. And I'm going to go ahead and just hit replace up at the top, and then we can replace the entire variable name. And instead of going through and hitting replace all, I'm going to be a little bit more delicate and just go find next and then replace, and then I'll replace the one right up at the top at the end. There we go. So I'm going to head through and just replace the rest of the variable names and make this a little bit easier to read. And with that done, what I'll then do is just typically have a read through of my code, make sure I haven't made any mistakes, but just make sure that I'm happy with how everything is named. What I'll then do with my code is I'll come through and I'll tend to add as many comments as possible in different blocks. Now the comments that we add depend on obviously whoever's going to be reading our UCSs and looking at our code, but I do tend to add as many as possible. There's a couple of different ways of adding comments with code. If we just edit this, what we can do is we can just add comments with a double slash there, or if we want to add a complete block of comments, what we can do is, if I just make myself a little bit of space, what we can do if we put a slash and an asterisk, and as soon as I do that, you'll see that the rest of my code then becomes commented. So I need to close that block off, and I'm just going to do that with an asterisk and a slash, and at that point we can include as many comments in that block as we like. I'm not going to make you watch me go through the entire UCS with the typical types of comments that I would put in here, but don't be too scared of commenting your code. Don't be scared of putting anything obvious. You might think it's really obvious what the code is doing, but the next person that opens this UCS might not, so you might be saving somebody hours. The next couple of things that I need to do with my UCS is really just to make it user-friendly for the people who are going to be using it on a day-to-day. So I'm going to start off just going through my code, and I can see I've got several different options in here for things like a set filler side, a set filler connection, extend filler to wall, and essentially I've got all my different options in here. I've got a bit of a funky naming system going on. And I'll just take out the my reference in these as well. And if I just close this down, if you've renamed your CV attributes to control the options that we've got on the left hand side, rather than going through and replacing and deleting them, because obviously we've renamed them, it's probably going to be easier just to drag a new assembly in and set the options again. So I'm just going to delete this one and I'm going to drag in another assembly and just enable my UCSs. Now what you might have noticed is the options that we've got on the left hand side are always laid out alphabetically. So you can see the option set fill aside has actually gone from being up at the top to the bottom. So if I just tick a few more options, you should be able to see that this is actually going to move around depending on what we've got ticked. So what I like to do with my UCSs is I like to force the order of this. So if I just head back into my UCS, I'm going to head down and just find the descriptions that I want to begin to modify. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is the fill aside. And I'm going to add a prefix of this, an abbreviated version again of the UCS name. And I'm just going to call this 1. And then for the other options, I'm going to essentially do the same. So for our connection, this affects obviously both sides. So I'm going to set this to 2. So we're going to have this option up at the top and then this option. And then what I'm going to do for the left and right hand sides, I'm going to set this one to be 3. And then the other side, I'm going to set to be number 4. And the effect that this should have is it should group together the options for the left and the right hand side. So with that done, I can then head back down to my job and I'm gonna, again, rather than going through and removing the parameters, I'm just gonna drag in another assembly to take a look at the effects. So on my left hand side now, I now have add side fill as 1. And if I set this, you'll see that 2 is our connection and then 3 is the option for the left filler and 4 is the options for the right filler. So it'll always maintain the current order that I've got. So again, it's just a little bit more consistent when we're going over on the left hand side to make sure that the option that we expect to be there in the place that we expect it to be is there. The last thing that I'd like to do with my UCS is I'd like to have the ability to set default values, but without having to edit the code of the UCS itself. Take for example the width of the filler we've got over on the left hand side. By default I've got this set at 3 inches, but on one system I might want to set my default at 3 inches, and on another system I might want to set that as something a little bit more modest at 1.5. Now currently with the UCS, if I've got one user that wants to do that, they'd have to edit the UCS and edit the code, and if we had another, they'd have to do the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head back into my UCSs, I'm going to head back into code, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to pick out all the different options where I do actually want to be able to set this on a global level. And I'm just going to copy that directly into Notepad. So I'm just going to grab this variable here where I'm setting my parameter, and I'm going to grab a couple more as well. So I'd like to be able to set the connection on a global level, but I think I'd also like to be able to set the default size for the filler width and possibly the overlap as well. I'm going to leave the option to extend the left and right fillers on cab level, so we set these each time, because I feel like this is something we'd probably want to set on cab level rather than set a default setting for it. So I'm going to just copy these out. I don't care about if I grab some logic with this as well. And I'm just going to get it into Notepad. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to close my UCS down, and on the left hand side I'm going to take a look, because this is where we're going to build up some public variables. And the public variables are essentially constants which are added to our UCS, but these help us set some default values for the options that we're going to be adding in. So I'm going to start off by adding a new variable, and I'm going to call this one filler width. And what I am going to do with this is I'm going to have a naming system to it. And I like to include, again, the name of the UCS that we're using this in. And I like to distinguish between the two because we can often obviously have settings or attributes which are going to have the same name. So I'll just use GB as global, but obviously you can include your own. And then the prompt, I'm going to put filler width. And we're going to leave the type as a measurement, and I'm going to just set this one to be in 3. And now what we've got is the option on the left hand side just to be able to input whatever default size we want for our fillers. So what we need to do is we need to reference this back in our UCS. So I'm just going to head into edit this, and I'm going to grab the name here. And what we can do on this one is we just need to include, instead of hard coding this to 3, we can set this right up at the top. Now, whenever we come to add a new filler and we turn off the extend, it's going to choose our default setting from the public variable that we've got set. The next option that I'm going to set as a default is the overlap for the filler and the end panel. So again, I'm going to close this down and head back into my public variables. This one is bool. So I'm going to give it a name. And now for the value on this one, I could set this at 1, 0, true or false. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple of choices in for this one. And I'm going to set on to be 1. And as you can guess, I'm going to set off to be 0. And again, all I need to do is just grab the name of the variable that I'm adding in. And I'm going to set this one off by default. And then back into my code. And then I can use this as a default value. And I'm just going to make sure with these variables, I've actually got them set as I would expect down here. Yeah, so we've got it set in here as well. So the next one that we want to set is the connection. And this is a little bit different because with this one, we're using a choice list. And it's different because with the other variables or attributes that we're setting, you'll notice how I'm actually setting the default value when I create the attribute in the first place. And it's a little bit different for a choice list because the default value essentially is our list we're going to be choosing from. So with this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save changes to our UCS, and I'm going to add in a new option here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to be a text. Again, I'm going to give it a name. And I'm also going to include some choices for this as well. And for this one, I'm going to include the exact values that I've got listed in my other choice list to set the connection. So these ones here. So I'm going to start off obviously with a none. And then just run through and add the different connection types. It is always better to copy and paste in this section just to make sure you get the right ones. You see that I've got an uppercase and a lowercase in there. And then we've got a screw connector as our last one. So again, if I just copy this out, I'm going to select the default and I'm going to set it to a dowel by default. And then when I head back into my code, as I mentioned before, this one is a little bit different because we're working with the choice list and we can't set the default value in the same way we did for the other variables. So what we're going to do is we're going to handle this with a little bit more functionality inside our function up here. So I need to start off by making sure that I'm passing the default connection name as a string as an argument to my function. I don't have anything to accept it yet, but I'm just going to copy that in there. And then what I'm going to do is just add myself a new option of just force value. And then what I'm going to do within my section where I'm creating the choice list to begin with, only if it doesn't exist, I'm then going to do this dot set choice value. Help if I spell it correctly. And this accepts two things. It accepts the name of the choice list itself and then the value that we want to set. So what we're going to do is just put force value in there and then take the name. And the last thing that I need to do is just encase this in an if statement. And we're going to do that just to make sure if we're not passing anything here and we don't actually want to set a default value, we don't. So once I'm happy with this, I'm just going to head back down to assembly level. I'm going to click on my assembly here and I'm going to set here that I want nothing, so I get rid of all my attributes, and then I'm going to select both again. So now I can see that I've got my filler connection set to dowel by default. I've got my filler width for left and right set to 2 inches, and I've also got my filler overlap in here as well. So this is the sort of typical process that I go through when I go about finishing and finalizing my UCS. And the very last thing that I'm going to do with my UCS, and probably the most important thing, is I'm going to give it to somebody else to test it. Now it's really important when we're writing UCSs to utilize other people, have them test it for you, because they might have a different approach, they might use it in a different method that you're not quite expecting with a different construction method, and it'll highlight any flaws or weaknesses that you've got within that UCS. Hopefully you found this episode and this mini-series useful. Feel free to give us a like, share and subscribe. We're also on Facebook, that's facebook.com/thecabinetvisionguy, and Instagram too, that's instagram.com/thecabinetvisionguy. Cheers!